October 12, 200 AD, Guandu, Central Plains of China. At precisely the hour of the rat, when darkness consumed the Yellow River Valley, a military advisor named Zhu Yu stumbled into Cao Cao's command tent, his robes torn, his face streaked with dirt and desperation. What he revealed would decide the fate of China itself, the exact location of Yuan Shao's cavalry reserves. 10,000 war horses, the largest mounted force ever assembled in the Three Kingdoms era, guarded by a skeleton crew at Wuchao granary, 20 li north of the main battle lines. By dawn, those horses would vanish, not captured in honorable combat, not surrendered through negotiation, stolen, in what military historians would later recognize as the most audacious cavalry theft in ancient warfare. A single night raid that would collapse the most powerful army in China and reshape the course of an empire. But the truth was far more terrifying than simple military tactics. Because what Cao Cao did that night wouldn't just win a battle. It would reveal the depths of strategic ruthlessness that one man would embrace to unify a fractured nation, and the terrible price paid by those who stood in his way. Before we uncover the truth about the Battle of Guandu cavalry, 200 AD Yuan Shao's 10,000 horses captured by Cao Cao's night raid, the decisive cavalry theft that changed Chinese history, make sure to subscribe to Fierce Sermon and ring that notification bell. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's journey back to ancient China, where ambition, betrayal, and a single night of violence would determine who would rule the Middle Kingdom. The year 200 AD marked the dying gasps of the Han Dynasty, a regime that had governed China for 4 centuries. But by the turn of the 3rd century, the empire had fractured into warring territories, each controlled by warlords who commanded private armies numbering in the tens of thousands. Central China had become a chessboard of violence. The Yellow River Valley, once the prosperous heartland of Chinese civilization, now bore the scars of endless warfare. Villages lay abandoned, their populations either fled or conscripted into armies that consumed men like a furnace consumes wood. The soil, once fertile and carefully tended, had been trampled by countless military campaigns until the very earth seemed exhausted. In this chaos, 2 men emerged as the primary contenders for ultimate power. Yuan Shao controlled the north, 4 provinces rich in population and resources. Born into one of China's most prestigious families, Yuan commanded respect through lineage alone. His family had served as high ministers for 4 generations, and this pedigree translated into an army of over 100,000 men, with a cavalry force that dwarfed any rival. 10,000 mounted warriors, each selected from the finest horsemen of the northern steppes. These weren't simply soldiers on horseback. They were professional cavalrymen whose families had ridden for generations, men who could fire arrows at full gallop, and whose charges could break infantry formations like waves against sand. Cao Cao controlled the south, smaller territories, fewer men, but a mind that operated on a different plane entirely. Born into a family of lesser officials, Cao Cao possessed no prestigious bloodline, no ancestral claim to authority. What he had was genius, a strategic intelligence so profound that his contemporaries struggled to predict his movements. He studied warfare not as honor-bound combat, but as applied psychology, understanding that battles were won in the minds of enemies before a single sword was drawn. By autumn of 200 AD, these 2 forces had been maneuvering around each other for months, probing defenses, testing resolve. The standoff centered on Guandu, a fortified position along the Yellow River where Cao Cao had established defensive works that controlled the south. RN approached to Yuan Shao's territories. Yuan Shao's strategy was simple, overwhelming force. With numerical superiority of nearly 3-to-1 and cavalry dominance, he would simply crush Cao Cao's smaller army through sheer mass. His war council spoke confidently of victory within weeks. After all, Cao Cao's forces were already stretched thin, provisions running low, morale beginning to fracture under the psychological pressure of facing such impossible odds. But something wasn't right. Cao Cao's scouts reported unusual patterns in Yuan Shao's camp. The main army remained at Guandu, yes, but supply trains were moving north with suspicious frequency. Large cavalry detachments were rotating away from the front lines, not into them. For an army preparing a decisive assault, Yuan Shao's forces seemed strangely dispersed. In Cao Cao's command tent, military advisors argued late into each night. Some counseled retreat, consolidate forces, preserve the army, live to fight another day. Others suggested desperate offensive strikes, gambling everything on breaking Yuan Shao's will before resources completely evaporated. Cao Cao listened to all of them, and rejected every suggestion, because he was waiting. Not for reinforcements, not for a change in weather or season. He was waiting for human nature to reveal itself. Waiting for the inevitable fractures that appear in every large organization, the personal grievances and wounded pride that turn allies into informants. He was waiting for someone to betray Yuan Shao. The first crack appeared on October 8th, 4 days before everything would unravel. A messenger from Yuan Shao's camp arrived at Cao Cao's forward positions under flag of truce, carrying correspondence that seemed routine, a formal challenge to battle, the kind of ceremonial communication expected between armies of this era. But the messenger lingered longer than necessary. Made eye contact with Cao Cao's guards that lasted just a fraction too long. Before departing, he dropped a silk handkerchief, then retrieved it with exaggerated clumsiness. Standard espionage tradecraft. A signal that information channels were open. Cao Cao's intelligence officers, men trained in the subtle arts that existed alongside conventional warfare, noted the incident. They began watching Yuan Shao's camp with renewed focus, looking not for military movements but for political tensions. Who sat together during meals? Who avoided whose gaze? The small behavioral indicators that suggested fracturing loyalty. They didn't have to wait long. The second incident occurred on October 9th, and this time the signal was less subtle. Another messenger arrived, this one requesting private audience with Cao Cao himself on matters of strategic importance. The request was unusual but not unprecedented. Sometimes officers sought to defect, trading information for safety or advancement. Cao Cao granted the audience. What the messenger revealed changed everything. Zhu Yu, one of Yuan Shao's senior military advisors, a man who had helped plan the entire Guandu campaign, was considering defection, not out of ideological conversion or newfound loyalty to Cao Cao, but because of something far more ancient and reliable, wounded pride. Yuan Shao had publicly rebuked Zhu Yu during a war council 3 days earlier. The specific criticism involved a disagreement over supply line management, a technical matter that should have been resolved privately. Instead, Yuan Shao had humiliated Zhu Yu in front of junior officers, questioning his competence and loyalty. The messenger conveyed that Zhu Yu was considering his options. This was delicate ground. Cao Cao knew that disgruntled advisors sometimes acted as double agents, feeding false information to test enemy responses. He ordered his intelligence officers to verify Zhu Yu's claims through independent channels. Scouts were dispatched to observe Yuan Shao's supply movements, informants within merchant caravans that traded with. Both armies were queried about grain shipments. The third incident, verification, came on October 10th. Cao Cao's scouts confirmed that Yuan Shao had indeed established a massive supply depot at Wuchao, approximately 40 li north of the main Guandu fortifications. More importantly, they confirmed the depot's vulnerability. While Yuan Shao's main army numbered over 100,000 men, the Wuchao garrison consisted of fewer than 1,000 soldiers. The logic seemed sound from Yuan Shao's perspective. The granary was behind his own lines, protected by the sheer presence of his massive army between it and Cao Cao's forces. No enemy would be foolish enough to bypass 100,000 men to raid a supply depot. But there was something else at Wuchao, something the scouts initially dismissed as routine logistics: the cavalry reserves. 10,000 horses, representing the core of Yuan Shao's military superiority, were stationed at Wuchao alongside the grain supplies. Again, the logic appeared sound. Cavalry required enormous quantities of fodder, so positioning them near the supply depot reduced transportation costs. The horses could graze in the nearby river valley while remaining close to stored grain reserves. Military efficiency, logical resource management. But to Cao Cao's analytical mind, this represented something else entirely: opportunity. Because 10,000 horses didn't just represent military power. They represented the psychological foundation of Yuan Shao's entire campaign. His soldiers believed victory was inevitable precisely because of cavalry superiority. Officers planned tactics around mounted operations. The entire army's morale rested on the assumption that their cavalry could dominate any battlefield engagement. Remove the horses, and you removed more than military assets. You removed certainty. You introduced doubt into the minds of 100,000 men who had never questioned victory. The fourth incident, the point of no return, occurred on the night of October 11th. Zhu Yu himself appeared at Cao Cao's camp. He arrived under cover of darkness, traveling with only 2 personal servants, his formal advisor's robes abandoned for common traveler's clothing. Guards brought him directly to Cao Cao's tent, where the warlord himself waited. Historical records suggest Cao Cao greeted Shu Yu not as a defector or subordinate, but as an honored guest. He ordered wine served, asked about Shu Yu's journey, inquired after his family's well-being. The psychological manipulation was masterful, treating Shu Yu with the respect Yuan Shao had denied, validating his wounded dignity even before any information was exchanged. Then Shu Yu spoke the words that would doom Yuan Shao's army. "The Wuchao granary holds your enemy's fate. The garrison is weak, the guards are complacent. They drink heavily each night, believing themselves safe behind Yuan Shao's army. The cavalry reserves graze in the valley with minimal oversight, strike there, burn the supplies, scatter the horses, and Yuan Shao's campaign collapses within days. You provided specific details, guard rotation schedules, the granary's layout, the exact location of the cavalry picket lines, even the names of the commanding officers and their personal habits. It was comprehensive intelligence that could only come from someone with intimate knowledge of Yuan Shao's operational planning. But Cao Cao didn't move immediately. Instead, he questioned Shu Yu for hours, probing for inconsistencies, testing the intelligence against what his own scouts had reported. Some historical accounts suggest Cao Cao even challenged Shu Yu directly, suggesting this might be an elaborate trap designed to lure Cao Cao's forces into ambush. Shu Yu's response was telling. "If this were deception, would I have brought my entire family into your camp? My wife, my sons, they are here, placing themselves under your protection. My life and theirs depend on the accuracy of what I've told you. Yuan Shao has destroyed my Ho. Nor, I will destroy his army." Personal vendetta validated by personal risk. The psychology rang true. Cao Cao made his decision. Not a cavalry raid, not a supply disruption operation, a complete decapitation strike. Burn the granaries, steal the horses, shatter the psychological foundation of Yuan Shao's campaign in a single night of orchestrated chaos. What authorities would discover at dawn would challenge everything Yuan Shao believed about warfare, loyalty, and the permanence of military advantage. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries from history. The events of that night would be so brutal, so perfectly executed, that they'd be studied in military academies for the next 1800 years. Let's discover what happens next. October 12, 200 AD, Hour of the Tiger, approximately 4:00 a.m. The Wuchao garrison commander, Chun Yu Tiong, had been drinking. This wasn't unusual. Senior officers in Yuan Shao's army enjoyed privileges that included quality wine, comfortable quarters, and the assumption of safety that came from serving in an army so large it seemed invincible. Chun Yu Tiong had spent the evening entertaining fellow officers, celebrating what they assumed would be an inevitable victory over Cao Cao. The granary complex itself was extensive. Multiple storage buildings containing grain reserves sufficient to feed Yuan Shao's entire army for 3 months. The buildings were constructed from wood and packed earth, efficient for storage but vulnerable to fire. This vulnerability had been noted during initial construction, but the architects determined that the granary's position behind Yuan Shao's army made it effectively invulnerable to enemy action. The cavalry reserves occupied the river valley east of the granary, where horses grazed on autumn grass under minimal guard. 10,000 animals represented an enormous logistical challenge. They required constant water access, regular movement to prevent overgrazing, and careful monitoring for illness or injury. The cavalry officers had established a rotation system. Different mounted units would rotate through Wuchao for rest and refitting while their horses recovered from campaign stress. On the night of October 11th, approximately 3,000 horses and their handlers were present at Wuchao. The remaining 7,000 were distributed among nearby valleys, all within a day's march of the main granary complex. At 3:30 a.m., perimeter guards noticed movement in the darkness beyond the firelight. What they saw initially seemed impossible. Riders approaching from the south, from the direction of Cao Cao's positions. But that would require bypassing Yuan Shao's main army, navigating 40 li of contested territory in complete darkness, coordinating thousands of men moving in absolute silence. The guards hesitated. Protocol demanded they sound the alarm, but sounding the alarm for a false identification would mean punishment. Some accounts suggest the guards assumed they were seeing Yuan Shao's own cavalry units returning from patrol. That hesitation proved fatal. Cao Cao had personally led 5,000 hand-picked troops on the raid, not his full army, that would have left his own positions vulnerable. Just enough men to accomplish the mission, light cavalry for speed, infantry with fire materials for the granary assault, and specialty units trained in rapid horse acquisition. They had marched through the night, using paths identified by Xu Yu's intelligence. When they encountered Yuan Shao's pickets, they didn't engage. They bypassed them, using darkness and terrain to avoid detection. The entire force moved with discipline that suggested months of preparation, though the decision to raid had been made less than 12 hours earlier. This was Cao Cao's genius on display. The ability to pivot from defensive posture to aggressive assault with virtually no transition time, transforming strategic intelligence into kinetic action while the formation remained current. The assault began at 3:45 a.m. Cao Cao's forces split into 3 coordinated groups. The first moved directly against the granary buildings, carrying oil-soaked materials and fire arrows. The second swept toward Chun Yuqiong's command quarters, targeting the leadership. The third, the largest contingent, descended into the river valley where the cavalry reserves grazed. The granary burned first. Contemporary accounts describe flames that could be seen for miles, a conflagration so intense it created its own wind patterns. The wooden storage buildings ignited almost simultaneously, suggesting Cao Cao's forces had positioned incendiary teams at multiple points before beginning the assault. Within minutes, 3 months of grain reserves were transformed into ash and smoke, but the real objective was the horses. In the river valley, Cao Cao's cavalry specialists implemented a technique that suggested careful planning. Rather than attempting to fight Yuan Shao's handlers, they used noise and fire to create chaos. Torches thrown into dry grass, war drums beaten in synchronized patterns designed to startle horses into flight, and then, critically, organized teams of riders who began herding the panicked animals south, away from Wuchao, toward Cao Cao's own territory. What unfolded was less a battle than a catastrophe. Yuan Shao's garrison, already compromised by drinking and complacency, attempted to mount a defense. Chun Yuqiong himself managed to rally approximately 300 soldiers and engaged Cao Cao's forces near the burning granary. The fighting was brief and brutal. Historical records indicate Chun Yuqiong was captured alive, his nose cut off in the field, a traditional mark of dishonor that would brand him permanently as a failure. Meanwhile, in the river valley, 3,000 horses were being driven south in an operation that demonstrated extraordinary logistical sophistication. Cao Cao's forces had established relay points, locations where fresh riders could take over herding duties while exhausted teams fell back to rest. The horses themselves, already conditioned to follow herd instincts, moved as a unified mass once initial panic subsided. By 5:00 a.m., as dawn light began filtering across the Yellow River Valley, the situation at Wuchao had become clear. The granary complex was completely destroyed. Chun Yuqiong and most of his senior officers were dead or captured, and approximately 3,000 horses, 1/3 of Yuan Shao's total cavalry reserves, were gone, driven south toward Cao Cao's territory by forces that had vanished back into the landscape as quickly as they'd appeared. Messengers dispatched from Wuchao reached Yuan Shao's main camp at approximately 6:00 a.m. The initial reports were confused, contradictory. Some claimed a full-scale assault by Cao Cao's entire army. Others suggested a smaller raid. All agreed on the fundamental facts. The granaries were destroyed. The cavalry was scattered. Chun Yuqiong had failed catastrophically. Yuan Shao's response would reveal everything about why he would ultimately lose not just this battle, but his entire bid for supremacy in China. Yuan Shao's war council convened within 30 minutes of receiving news from Wuchao. The tent was crowded with senior military officers, each advocating different responses with the urgency of men who recognized their entire campaign had just been compromised. Some argued for immediate pursuit of Cao Cao's raiding force, catch them burdened with stolen horses, destroy them in the field. Others counseled caution, reinforce defensive positions, prevent further raids, reassess the overall strategic situation. Yuan Shao made the worst possible decision, paralysis disguised as deliberation. Rather than committing fully to either pursuit or defense, he divided his forces. A contingent of 10,000 men was dispatched north to assess the Wuchao situation and attempt to recover the scattered cavalry. Meanwhile, his main army remained at Guandu, neither advancing nor retreating, occupying a strategic limbo that benefited no one. This indecision was precisely what Cao Cao had anticipated. By 10:00 a.m. on October 12th, Cao Cao's forces had successfully integrated the captured horses into their own cavalry units. 3,000 animals represented an enormous influx of military capability, transforming Cao Cao from a commander whose cavalry was vastly outnumbered to one approaching parity with Yuan Shao's mounted forces. But the psychological impact was even more significant. News of the Wuchao disaster spread through Yuan Shao's camp with the speed of panic. Soldiers who had believed victory was inevitable now questioned everything. If their impregnable supply depot could be destroyed in a single night, what else might Cao Cao accomplish? If their cavalry superiority could evaporate in hours, what guaranteed their numerical advantage would prove decisive? Military historians would later identify this as the critical moment when psychological warfare superseded conventional combat. Yuan Shao still commanded more men, still held superior positions, still possessed theoretical advantages in nearly every category of military measurement, but his army had stopped believing in victory. The pursuit force Yuan Shao dispatched to Wuchao returned on October 13th with devastating news. The remaining cavalry reserves, the 7-0 horses distributed in valleys near Wuchao, had scattered during the night raid and were now dispersed across hundreds of square miles. Some had been captured by Cao Cao's follow-up forces. Others had simply fled the chaos, reverting to wild behavior. Recovery efforts were ongoing, but military command of the cavalry reserves had effectively ceased to exist. Yuan Shao's officers began defecting. The first to abandon the campaign was Zhang He, a senior cavalry commander who recognized that without mounted superiority, Yuan Shao's strategic position had become untenable. Zhang He approached Cao Cao's camp under truce flag on October 15th and offered his services, bringing with him approximately 2,000 cavalry troops who had chosen loyalty to their immediate commander over abstract allegiance to Yuan Shao. This triggered a cascade effect. If a senior officer like Zhang He was defecting, what did that signal about the campaign's prospects? Other officers began making discreet inquiries about terms of surrender or defection, not because they harbored particular loyalty to Cao Cao, but because the mathematical realities of military power had fundamentally shifted. By October 20th, just 8 days after the Wuchao raid, Yuan Shao's army had begun a general withdrawal northward. The retreat was not a rout exactly. Yuan Shao maintained enough organizational control to prevent complete collapse, but the campaign was over. An army of 100,000 men that had seemed poised to crush Cao Cao's smaller forces had been psychologically defeated by a single night's action that had killed fewer than 500 soldiers, but had stolen the foundation of strategic confidence. The legal and political aftermath was complex. In the fractured landscape of 3rd century China, there was no central authority to investigate war crimes or enforce conventions of combat. Each warlord operated as sovereign within his territory, answerable only to the theoretical legitimacy of the Han Emperor, a figurehead whose actual power had evaporated decades earlier. But within Yuan Shao's own territories, investigations were conducted. How had security at Wuchao failed so catastrophically? Who bore responsibility for the disaster? The obvious culprit was Chunyu Qiong, the garrison commander who had survived capture by Cao Cao's forces. When he was eventually returned to Yuan Shao's camp through a prisoner exchange in November 200 AD, he faced immediate interrogation about his failure. Historical records indicate Yuan Shao ordered Chunyu Qiong executed, but not for the tactical failure of losing Wuchao. Instead, he charges focused on dereliction of duty, specifically the drinking and complacency that had left the garrison vulnerable. The execution was public, designed to demonstrate that Yuan Shao punished failure severely and would tolerate no repetition of such disasters. But the real investigation should have focused on Xu Yu. Yuan Shao's intelligence officers conducted retrospective analysis of how Cao Cao had acquired such precise information about Wuchao's vulnerabilities. They interrogated surviving garrison members, examined patrol logs, reviewed personnel movements. The conclusion was inescapable. Someone with detailed operational knowledge had provided intelligence to Cao Cao. Xu Yu's defection became known within days of the raid, but by then he was safely integrated into Cao Cao's command structure. Yuan Shao issued formal denunciations, declaring Xu Yu a traitor and ordering his execution if ever captured. But these were empty gestures. The damage was complete. What's remarkable is how Yuan Shao failed to understand the broader implications of Xu Yu's betrayal. This wasn't simply one disgruntled advisor selling information. It was evidence of systemic problems within Yuan Shao's leadership style. He had humiliated a senior officer over a relatively minor disagreement, prioritizing his own ego over organizational cohesion. That single moment of poor judgment had cascaded into strategic catastrophe. Cao Cao, by contrast, understood that warfare in this era was as much about managing human psychology as managing military formations. He cultivated loyalty not through family prestige or traditional authority, but through demonstrated competence and respect for capable subordinates. Officers who served Cao Cao might fear his strategic brilliance, but they rarely felt personally diminished in his presence. The political consequences extended far beyond the immediate battle. Yuan Shao's retreat from Guandu marked the beginning of his political decline. Other warlords who had been watching the confrontation, waiting to align with whomever emerged victorious, began shifting their allegiances. If Yuan Shao, with all his advantages, couldn't defeat Cao Cao, then perhaps Cao Cao represented the future of Chinese unification. Territory that Yuan Shao controlled began fragmenting. Local governors, sensing weakness, declared independence or sought separate accommodations with Cao Cao. By 202 AD, Yuan Shao had lost effective control of 2 of his 4 provinces. Yuan Shao himself died in 202 AD, though historical records are unclear about whether death resulted from illness or was hastened by the psychological devastation of his defeat. After his death, his sons engaged in internecine warfare over succession, further fragmenting what had been the most powerful political bloc in northern China. Meanwhile, Cao Cao used the captured cavalry to consolidate his own military position. The 3,000 horses taken at Wuchao, plus additional animals acquired through subsequent defections and operations, transformed his forces into a mobile, aggressive army capable of projecting power across vast distances. By 204 AD, Cao Cao had conquered most of Yuan Shao's former territory. The cavalry that had once represented Yuan Shao's greatest military asset now served the man who had stolen them in a single night of audacious violence. But there's a darker element to this story that historical records often obscure. What happened to the cavalry handlers, the soldiers whose primary duty was caring for Yuan Shao's horses, who were present at Wuchao during the raid? Most were killed. Some in combat as they attempted to defend the granary or prevent the horses from being driven away. But others were executed systematically by Cao Cao's forces during the raid itself. These weren't combatants who fell in battle. They were logistics personnel who represented knowledge that Cao Cao couldn't allow to survive. If the handlers lived, they could potentially identify the techniques Cao Cao's forces used to herd the horses, potentially allowing Yuan Shao to develop countermeasures. So they were eliminated, quickly, efficiently, with the same cold calculation that characterized the entire operation. Historical sources mention this only obliquely, if at all. But the mathematics are inescapable. Approximately 300 cavalry handlers were stationed with the horses at Wuchao. After the raid, fewer than 20 survived to return to Yuan Shao's camp. This wasn't collateral damage of combat. It was systematic elimination of witnesses and expertise, and it reveals the true nature of what Cao Cao accomplished that night. Not merely a brilliant tactical raid, but a comprehensive operation that destroyed not just physical assets, but also the human knowledge required to replace them. Yuan Shao lost not only his horses but also the trained personnel who could have rebuilt his cavalry capabilities. This was warfare elevated to an art form, where victory wasn't merely defeating the enemy's army, but erasing their capacity to ever challenge you again. The Battle of Guandu, and specifically the Wuchao raid, fundamentally altered Chinese military doctrine for centuries. Prior to 200 AD, warfare among the warlords of the late Han Dynasty had followed relatively conventional patterns. Armies clashed in open battle. Victory went to whichever side could maintain cohesion longer, and strategic advantage derived primarily from numerical superiority and traditional military virtues like cavalry prowess or infantry discipline. Cao Cao demonstrated something different. Asymmetric warfare where intelligence and psychological operations mattered more than raw military power. Military academies throughout subsequent Chinese history studied the Wuchao raid as a masterclass in what later theorists would call deception warfare. The principle was simple but profound. Your enemy's greatest strength can become their greatest vulnerability if you can convince them their strength is secure. Yuan Shao believed his cavalry superiority made him invincible. That belief led him to position his cavalry reserves in a location that optimized logistical efficiency while minimizing security. The very asset he relied on most became the vector through which Cao Cao destroyed him. This concept influenced Chinese military thinking for over a millennium. When Sun Tzu's Art of War was compiled into its final form during the subsequent centuries, the Wuchao raid served as a practical example of the text's principles. All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. But the implications extended beyond military strategy into political philosophy. The Wuchao raid demonstrated that in times of chaos, meritocracy could defeat aristocracy. Yuan Shao represented the old order, power derived from family prestige, authority assumed through birthright. Cao Cao represented something newer and more threatening to traditional hierarchies, power through competence, authority earned through demonstrated capability. This terrified the aristocratic class. If someone like Cao Cao, of common birth and undistinguished lineage, could defeat the most prestigious families through sheer intellectual capability, what did that mean for the entire social order? The answer became clear over the following decades. Traditional aristocratic power was dying, being replaced by meritocratic systems where competence mattered more than bloodline. Cao Cao himself would eventually establish the Kingdom of Wei, one of the three kingdoms that succeeded the Han Dynasty. His successors would implement civil service reforms that prioritized talent over family connections, fundamentally restructuring how Chinese government functioned. The Wuchao raid also established precedents for intelligence operations that would persist throughout Chinese history. The concept of cultivating insider defections, identifying the woe, undid pride or personal grievances that could turn loyal advisors into informants, became standard practice. Subsequent military commanders studied how Cao had recognized the opportunities Zhu Yu represented and exploited it with psychological precision. Intelligence services throughout later Chinese dynasties would employ similar techniques. Identify individuals with access to critical information, assess their vulnerabilities, financial pressure, wounded ego, ideological disagreement, and create conditions where defection seemed like the rational choice. This approach to intelligence represented something more sophisticated than simple bribery or coercion. It was psychological warfare at the individual level, understanding that organizations were only as strong as the loyalty of their members, and that loyalty was always conditional, always subject to erosion through skilled manipulation. But perhaps the most lasting implication was what the Wuchao raid revealed about the nature of military logistics. Before 200 AD, supply lines and resource depots were considered secondary concerns, important, certainly, but not decisive in themselves. The Wuchao raid demonstrated that destroying an enemy's logistical foundation could be more effective than defeating their army in open battle. This recognition transformed warfare from a contest of immediate tactical superiority to a more complex competition involving supply chain management, resource distribution, and the protection of logistical infrastructure. Subsequent Chinese military campaigns placed enormous emphasis on securing supply depots, protecting granaries, and ensuring that cavalry reserves were never concentrated in vulnerable positions. The lessons learned from Yuan Shao's catastrophic failure became embedded in military doctrine. Similar patterns emerged in other historical contexts far removed from 3rd century China. When Napoleon emphasized that an army marches on its stomach, he was articulating principles that Cao Cao had demonstrated 1600 years earlier. When modern military theorists discuss targeting enemy logistics rather than frontline forces, they're applying concepts proven at Wuchao. The raid also revealed uncomfortable truths about the relationship between ethics and effectiveness in warfare. Cao Cao's systematic elimination of cavalry handlers wasn't honorable combat. It was calculated murder designed to destroy not just physical assets but human expertise. Yet it was also brutally effective, accomplishing strategic objectives that conventional warfare could not have achieved. This created a philosophical problem that Chinese military ethicists would grapple with for centuries. Does the effectiveness of an action justify its moral cost? If victory requires abandoning traditional codes of honor, is that victory worth achieving? Cao Cao's answer was clear. Victory justifies everything. The survival and eventual prosperity of the kingdom he built, however brutal its foundation, validated every ruthless decision he made. But that answer satisfied military commanders more than moral philosophers. The tension between effectiveness and ethics, between victory and virtue, remained unresolved in Chinese political thought, creating debates that continue to this day. Finally, the Wuchao raid demonstrated the fragility of military superiority. Yuan Shao's cavalry advantage seemed insurmountable, a quantifiable, observable superiority in one of warfare's most decisive capabilities. Yet it evaporated in a single night because he had failed to protect the physical manifestation of that advantage. This lesson applied far beyond military contexts. Any form of power, political, economic, technological, was only as secure as the systems protecting it. Advantages that seemed permanent could vanish if the underlying infrastructure was compromised. For the warlords watching Cao Cao's rise, this was a terrifying revelation. No advantage was safe. No superiority was guaranteed. Success required constant vigilance, not just against conventional threats, but against the asymmetric, unconventional approaches that could bypass traditional defenses entirely. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. It created an atmosphere of paranoia among military commanders, where trust became the scarcest resource and security measures proliferated to protect against increasingly creative threats. In many ways, the Wuchao raid marked the beginning of modern strategic thinking, where warfare became less about who had the bigger army and more about who could identify and exploit systemic vulnerabilities in their enemy's organization. And at the center of it all was a single night, in October 200 AD, when 10,000 horses vanished into darkness, taking with them the certainty of an empire. What do you think drove Cao Cao to such extreme measures that night at Wuchao? Was it pure strategic genius, or something darker, a willingness to embrace ruthlessness that his more honorable opponents couldn't match? Leave your theories in the comments below. Tell us, in times of chaos, is meritocracy built on competence and ruthlessness better than aristocracy built on tradition and honor? Where do you draw the line between brilliant strategy and unforgivable brutality? Subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of world history where a single night, a single decision, changed the course of civilizations. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the moments when everything changed. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.